Well, it's about 5:40 in the morning, and I have about 20 minutes before I need to go to work. And I've been having a difficult time finding the time to sit down and make videos, um, as well as catching up on all the things that I want to listen to. Recently, I've been training a new coworker who's been riding along with me for the last 3 weeks, so my time for listening to podcasts and videos and things like that's been reduced by about 40 hours, which makes it difficult to keep up, especially because there's a lot of really exciting things that have been coming out. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's come out recently that is really interesting to me. And I just wanted to do something so that I wouldn't forget. One of the really interesting things I watched was Paul VanderKlay talking about the Jonathan Pageau lecture that was on Jordan Peterson's podcast. And he was talking a lot about this question of trying to figure out the clash between science and the book of Genesis, and whether there is a clash or not. And one of the things that he spoke about was, this idea of concordism, which is trying to kind of fit the science into the Bible, or rework the biblical narrative to be interpreted in such a way as to explain the current science realities that we understand. And that leads to all sorts of things where people reinterpret the 7 days into 7 ages, and there's a lot of problems with that sort of thing, and it has been done poorly in the past. And I think that, what he's talked about is one of the appeals that Jordan Peterson had when he began doing these lectures on the Bible, is that he was doing that in a sort of way, but he was doing it from a psychological perspective. And I think that the really interesting thing that resonated with me is that, as I watched those lectures, Jordan would talk about, the interactions between people in the Bible, the human stories, the human element of the story. And he kept saying, it seems like it's saying that when, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And he would always say this, and he'd say, and that's exactly right. It's exactly right. And that was the thing that kept popping out at me every time I say it. So it was like, wow, yeah, it's almost as if these stories, and I think he does believe it in a sense, at least as far as the stories about the people. They're real stories about real things that happen to real people. Now, putting aside the first chapter of Genesis and the 7 days of creation, if you put that on pause for a moment, everything else about these stories, these human interactions, ring true, and they're not. Nobody comes out looking great in the Bible, because there is it doesn't have the sort of edited, way that you would present a story if you were trying to make someone look good. It doesn't read like propaganda. It reads like reality. It's like a news report. It's like, somebody thought that this thing that happened was so important that they needed to remember it, and they needed to write it down and save it and preserve it. And I think that in a lot of ways Jordan Peterson represents a new sort of prophet that was foretold by people like Francis Schaeffer, Christians who were not afraid of the authority that the materialist, secular, scientific world was coming forth with their concepts about Darwinism and how it disproved the Bible. And, you know, the truly courageous Christian is not afraid of science. And I think that, you know, when you look at somebody like Jordan Peterson, and there are many others, you know, here's a guy who who rejected the idea of, you know, biblical truth or whatever very early on, and embraced the scientific worldview, the materialist, modernist worldview, and that was his way of looking at the world, his way of interpreting it. It was his frame. The thing that he would not question was the ideas of Darwin and, you know, these evolutionary foundations of man. But within that framework, the more he learned about, through scientific research, through empirical research, the way that people actually are, and he learned about this science of people, psychology, and how our minds work, and learning about personality and what makes us tick and all these things, the more he learned about that, learning true things, when he picks up the Bible again later in life, his response is, this is exactly right. And I think that, you know, however we conceptualize the act of creation, you know, the belief that it just came about randomly and by chance and all these things it's just the evidence against that is just stacking up so high. And I think, you know, I know at some point there was a tweet about Jordan Peterson reading Stephen Meyer's book, The God Hypothesis, and I would be very excited to hear them have a conversation. Hopefully that's something that happens in the future. Recently, I've been listening to Eric Metaxas' book, his new book, which I know draws heavily on Meyer's book. It's called Is Atheism Dead? And it's just astounding that, you know, the study of science has become so fractured. People don't go to the university and learn all about all the different things and try to unite. The purpose of the university was to unite these different fields of studies into one coherent image. People don't do that anymore. Everybody's a specialist. Everybody learns about their thing and laser focuses and gets more and more specialized in their study. So like Jordan Peterson specialized in psychology. But there's all these other people in all these other fields that have been doing the same thing. And they all start with this framework that was built by Darwinism, Charles Lyell and his geological ideas, you know, that, you know, were the basis of expanding the supposed age of the Earth. And, you know, it's not to say that those ideas were you know, totally nonsense, because when people use that as their frame and they do the research, they get results that seems to indicate that that frame was not totally wrong. Now, I think now we're getting to the point where people are seeing that while it wasn't totally wrong, it's ultimately wrong. And that's why in all these various fields of study, people are surprised, because when we get really deep and narrow and specialized and we find out what really makes things tick, there's so many surprises. And things are not necessarily the way that we would predict if it was all random and chaos. And I think that, there's definitely some ambiguity in the Bible as to how things can be interpreted. And one thing that I have come to understand is that that's actually a wonderful and gracious thing. For me, whether or not the science proves or disproves it, if I'm reading the Bible, I want to read this story in a way that, at least from the point of Adam, it's a continuous story to today, and it's not 40,000 years or 100,000 years. Adam was recent, and I feel like that's because I want to read the story that way. I feel like that is the best way to read it, and I think that there's a lot of reason why, for me to interpret it, the flood is far more catastrophic than people tend to think in their mind. I do think it was global, and I think that for the sake of the narrative, that's the best way to read it. But if there are people that are so convinced that they can't abandon, the ideas of Darwin, the ideas of old Earth, and all these things, there's enough room in the way that the text is written, and in the fact that it was written in more primitive languages with less precise vocabulary, that they can believe that it's true. They can believe that the Bible is saying a thing that's true without having to abandon their frame that they're so used to. And so, in a way, it's this beautiful thing, because God is I think we're all probably wrong to some extent, and most of us don't admit how wrong we are about things, and we ask God, like, God, is this what you mean? Am I understanding this correctly? And none of us are understanding anything absolutely correctly. But to God, I said, yeah, you understand it well enough. God is kind of comfortable with our gist. We get the gist of things, which is something Peterson talked about recently in one of his other podcasts. And so I think that, the one thing I really don't appreciate is people who say, don't bother trying to study that or whatever. It's not important. It's not important if these things fit together. It's not important to reconcile the ideas of science and Genesis and creation and all these things, because it is symbolic or it is metaphorical or whatever. And I guess that's another way. If you really embrace the symbolic message, that Jonathan Pageau is putting forth, and I do think it's good and it's really interesting. I don't think you have to keep everything separate, because at some point, things really happened. Something really happened. Some person really existed, and they did something, and other people remembered it, and other people wrote it down. And, we can think about these ideas like archetypes, but they're based on something. The archetypes are based on some idea that came from somewhere. And that's something that I think you need to keep in mind. So that's kind of just some stuff I wanted to talk about a little bit. And I have a lot of interesting things that I've been thinking about, more specifically with more research and things that I've written down more and I plan to share. But I just wanted to give a little update on some of the things I've been thinking about and listening. And I think there's very exciting things that are happening in the intellectual world and the space on YouTube. And, all is not as dire as the news and the spiritual powers of this world would lead us to believe. I think that there's a lot more hope and a lot more positive things going on, and I think that good things will come in the future. So I just wanted to share that. So thank you for listening.